Cameron, you're going to talk about more code and fewer pixels. I think this is great, except that I recently bought a 4K monitor. So, like,
You can fit a lot of code in one.
I don't know how I'm supposed to program with fewer pixels. How do you read anything? All right, yes, thank you. Welcome, Cameron.
Clearly, I either need to have a more literal or less literal top title. Hey, my name is Cameron Daigle. I'm a designer, actually, at Hashrocket, which at Hashrocket, designers also write a fair deal of front-end code and a handful of JavaScript. So this talk is about my experiences over the years at Hashrocket and before. I've been using Rails since 1.2 or so. And what we've developed over the last few years to help facilitate moving an idea from pixels to code. And so, like, what we've developed are a bunch of tools that have helped us keep code out of, or keep changes out of pixels, and by that I mean keep it out of the mock-up world and in the repo and in the actual view. So, getting ahead of myself a little bit. First, let's talk about how scary it was to get here. I had to fly in from Portland after flying to Dallas, or Denver after flying from Jacksonville, Florida. And this was the smallest plane I've ever been on. That's me, the little scared yellow circle is me. I didn't like that at all. It was fun. Huh? I was number one. I was the number one most scared person on the plane. I also had a dumb speaker gag lined up about how this was still Ruby on coffee, but it's clearly already Ruby on Rails, or on Rails. So let's move on past that. So I want to talk about how things go from pixels to code, and talk about how that generally happens in our industry compared to how it happens at Hashrocket. You can compare and contrast about that with how it happens, at your place of work. Generally speaking, user-centered design is where we're at in the industry right now, I would say. And this is from Thomas Peterson from a couple of years ago. Posted this chart, which I think is pretty apt. This is more of an older waterfall style process, first of all. So you have an analysis phase where you talk through requirements. If you're familiar with story cards, you're going to work on that kind of thing. Then you're going to talk about how UI and UX and the information architecture is going to mesh everything together. You're going to move on into a design phase where your ideas and your UI are made visual. You're going to implement that stuff, and you're going to deploy it. All right, that's all well and good. You're familiar with this process. Revised UCD, as according to Thomas. You've got your analysis phase, UI, UX, information architecture. Design, implement, but throughout all of that you're deploying. You're getting code out, you're getting it working as soon as possible. And this is what some of you might know as rapid prototyping. The idea that you want to get something functioning before it's designed, before it's really implemented all the way, and just get something under somebody's fingertips. So this is all well and good, like I said. This is rapid prototyping. It's a great trend. I think it is. We've moved a long way away from waterfall and lots of work before something is actually functioning. But in my experience at Hashrocket, that structure doesn't always work for us. And maybe you work at a product shop, maybe you work at a consultancy with clients like I do. Whatever your situation is, you're reporting to someone. You're delivering something to someone in a client-type position, in a position of authority who has to sign off on what you've done. And generally, that person has somebody that they're reporting to. And so, for me, that means that when I'm designing something for a stakeholder, a client that might be working at a larger company, might be working for a startup, no matter what, whatever I give them, they have to then show to someone else. It's very rare that I'm in a situation where my client is the be-all, end-all of the sign-off point. In a perfect world, I'm talking directly to the person who's making all the decisions all the time. But in reality, that isn't always the case. So, I want to be talking to users directly. In real rapid prototyping, perfect world stuff, I'm deploying something to a server, I'm getting real users to use it, I'm learning from it immediately. So that never happens for us except for internal stuff that we're doing for Hashrocket. So there's going to be a client in the way. That client needs to see that stuff. Sometimes that client has a customer. They are the ones that are doing that stuff. So like, if we're working on a B2B application that's then sold to other people, which is totally a few different projects I've had in the last couple of years. And then, if we're working for a large company, who knows what kind of baggage that they're bringing along with them. Like, there are all of these things that are standing between us and being able to rapidly prototype something to the user. So that what that means for us is that we want to be able to get things out in front of people, but that stuff needs to look good, it needs to make sense, it needs to be something that they can turn around and show to someone else, without having to explain to someone else that, hey, this is just, this is an unstyled prototype of what might happen, we're just pushing some ideas out there. So, another thing that I firmly believe in that's just like literally everything I've ever had to deal with is that clients don't understand partial design. Like when you're trying to show an idea to someone, most of the time they're going to be distracted by something that isn't what you expected. And it's like if I were to show a comp to someone and say, hey, here's, just look at the center column here, don't pay attention to the stuff in the sidebar, I haven't done that yet. They're going to turn around to somebody else, and somebody else, I'm going to get a feedback on Basecamp, it's like, oh, the sidebar doesn't look right. Like that's going to happen. And so in his example of an argument for rapid prototyping is, say you're a company that makes a hammer. Should you show the hammer to the client on a piece of paper? Should you cut out a paper hammer and have the client hold the hammer? Should you produce a hammer in styrofoam and test it? Or should you produce the actual hammer you want to sell and have the client try and hammer and nails with it? Well, obviously you want to do number 4. I mean, this is very rhetorical. When it comes to software, when you are talking about developing a minimum viable product, you're trying to be faithful to the time and maybe budget allotment that you have, and you're trying to turn something around quickly. If you just go for the features and not the experience, you're going to end up with the minimum viable hammer, which might function as a hammer, it might have all of the physics that you want, it might even be the right material, but it's not going to look or feel like what the customer was expecting. And they're going to come back and say, I can't show this to whoever, whatever the next person is. And they're going to come back and say, why doesn't this look like what I was expecting? And you'll say, hey, it does exactly what we talked about. It's got all the feature requirements met, but it isn't what they were expecting. And the third thing I want to point out that is different and has resulted in this different process for us is that I don't think UX ends. And I think that unless you're in a situation where you have a dedicated UX person, which if you're a smaller team, you might not have that person, that UX is the responsibility of not just the designer, but everyone in the process, and it's something that doesn't stop. So when you look at this process, and this really is more of an explanation of how we do things than it is a nitpick on this graph, really. But UX ends there, user experience ends there, and at Hashrocket, I think of our process more as this. So we come in and we're going to gather our requirements. We're going to wireframe, which is sketch out. We have to use balsamic, but whatever your situation is, at some point a design or an idea lives on a whiteboard, it lives in a sketch. And we're going to story card, which for those of you who aren't familiar with story carding, a story card is a nugget of feature. Like it's a feature broken down into more or less its smallest component. So we're going to come out of a session with the client having gathered requirements, having learned, and having turned everything into sketches and story cards describing the functionality. Then we're going to move into look and feel, which is where myself and one of other designers is going to mock up either with new branding or with existing branding, whatever the situation is, something that the client can look at and really see and say, yes, that's the visual direction that I want to go in, that's what these pages should look like. And then we're going to implement and deploy. And then I think of the cyclical process, the early deployment. For us, it's more of a reaction. It's how quickly and how smoothly can we get to the point where the client is approving real features. And then when something changes, when requirements change or something needs to be fixed, we're going to react. And by react, I mean we're going to go as far back in this process as we need to. Like if it's something that can be fixed in the code base, let's do that. If it's something that has to go all the way back to rethinking look and feel, we'll do that. So that's a little bit about like how we move from pixels to code. So the way I like to think of it is that we're going to deliver to communicate. At every step of the process, when the client is receiving something from us, it's something that they can then use and that they can understand. We're using whatever thing that we give them is going to be the medium of communication. So that's kind of the basis of that stuff. We're going to move into expertise and handoffs. So you've got this idea, you've got this concept of stuff, sketch, pixels, code, conceptually. And the sketch is going to be done by idea guys. Whoever the client, the team at the beginning, at the outset, maybe non-technical people. Designers are going to handle pixels. Code's going to be handled by a developer. But let's think about it in terms of deliverables now. So you've got a team, and out of that team is going to come some wireframes in our case. And in our case, the designer is going to be delivering a PSD. And PSD throughout this, I don't know, the shorthand for whatever program your designer might use, an image, like a non-functioning mock-up. If you have a front-end person or a front-end team, they're going to be delivering HTML and CSS, and the developer is going to be delivering Ruby. So you've got, each of these phases has some physical item that's being passed on to the next phase, to the next expertise. And your situation might look completely different. You might have a UX designer whose only job is wireframes. He might hand off to a UI designer whose only job is to construct user interface components. He might hand off to a visual designer who actually lays the page out or applies the branding or puts in images or whatever. He might hand off to a front-end guy, and then this might be you over here. So you, as developers, could be 5 degrees removed from the initial idea, from the initial process. And what makes this even more difficult is that this isn't really this graph isn't fully representative of how complicated this could get. Because each of these phases involves overlap, it involves a handoff. It involves somebody whose expertise is in one area handing off to somebody whose expertise is in another area. And a lot of times, as that handoff happens, the product is going to change. You're going to be moving from a wireframe to a mockup, from a mockup to code of some sort, from non-functioning code to functioning code, maybe. So I think of it in terms of handing off from expertise to expertise. And that's not to say that each of these phases don't involve other people. It's not like each of us go into a dark closet and don't talk to anyone until we come out with comps or until we come out with views or whatever. But no matter how communicative your process is, somebody or some team of people is going to be the people responsible for delivering a particular item to the next group of people. Still Ruby on decaf for me. So this is Hashrocket circa 2010 when I joined. This is our real process. And the third block over here, that was my first experience. So I came in, did some slicing here and there, and then one day was handed a bunch of wireframes. And I wasn't involved in the process of making those wireframes. I didn't have access to the pivotal tracker at the time. I literally was just given wireframes and was told, hey, make these wireframes into some designs. Here's some other pages, make some PSDs out of these wireframes. It was very, disconcerting to me, and it was, I think, a flawed process in a lot of ways, but a process that was developed from us growing very quickly as a company and all sorts of other stuff. So this is how the process would work. The designer would sit with the client in a wireframing session, and they would take all of the ideas from the client and they would interpret them into wireframes. There might not even necessarily be a developer in this meeting. Then in a completely separate meeting, the client would sit with some developers. They would look at the wireframes that had been made separately, and they would write out, and the developers would sort of grok the wireframes and attempt to turn everything into an intended feature. So you can already tell there's a little bit of disconnect here, a little bit of difficulty. And then, or me or whoever, then is going to take wireframes without any real context and no idea of how developers interpreted the story cards, and then make things look pretty in a different phase entirely. I'm then going to hand them off to front end, who is going to do the HTML and CSS. I might do some of that too, and then some of the JavaScript would get done, And this was pretty common at the time. Our front-end people or me would like stub out AJAX calls to nothing, or like to a piece of JSON, and then just hand it off to a developer. The developer would make the JavaScript work, and they would write the Ruby. So here you'd have two big areas of handoff, and then some really disconnected, not even real handoff situations. So this is Hashrocket today, more or less. Wireframing is always done as a team, story carding is done as a team in an initial session. And once we start doing that, I can't imagine it happening any other way. Like the more people that are involved in the initial decisions when you're writing something or coming up with initial requirements, the better, up to a point, obviously. I don't mean everyone in your company should be in there, but have a developer there, have a designer there, that kind of thing. A designer would then deliver the wireframes more or less to themselves. We like to keep the same designer on the team or on a particular project. Then they handle, this is current, the PSDs, getting those signed off by the client. Then most all of the HTML and CSS, that's our designers handle all that stuff. And then the handoff point is actually right at the end there, where they're going to mock up as much as possible in HTML and CSS. The developer is then going to take that stuff and implement it, and we've actually at this point moved into almost all of our JavaScript being written by developers. So there's one big handoff point here, and it's one that I want to focus on in terms of the tools that we've come up with, because that, to me, is the biggest point of a potential friction and a potential confusion. Because if you look back at this process, it's all about reacting. And so when we're talking about delivering stuff from PSD to HTML and CSS to Ruby, JavaScript, being able to move backwards is tremendously important. Like being able to take something and modify it and without it becoming a big ordeal, and fix it, adjust, be agile, and change requirements and change features is really important. So that's kind of what our tools are about. They're about being able to develop something really quickly, but then be able to pull it out of the application, change it, and put it back in without it becoming really disorganized or messy. So what I want to tell you from those slides, I mean, that's our system. I'm sure if you're thinking about your own in that particular way, it's going to lay out significantly differently. Maybe you have a front-end guy, maybe your designers don't do any coding. Whatever your situation is, you need to understand where your expertise lie and where the handoffs are happening, and be able to facilitate those handoffs. So at some point, maybe your designer hands off to a developer who does all the coding. Maybe the designer does all your JavaScript, I don't know. But somebody at some point is primarily responsible, and they need to communicate their decisions and their ideas to another person. And hopefully that second person can do the same thing if you need to change something, move it back in. So know your expertise and facilitate your handoffs. So a little bit about our tool set, and this is really what all this is leading up to, is that we've focused on this area and we've tried to really smooth it out and address some of the biggest problems that we've had over the years in terms of getting stuff from a designer to a developer. Number one, really common problem, lack of context. So a developer is coming in, they have, they have a slice view, maybe in our situation, or maybe they have a comp or whatever. How do they know how that fits into everything else? How do they know how to get that thing, or how to get their questions answered in that particular case? And this was the earliest problem that we had, and we developed something really early on called the UI directory, which is about the most primitive thing that we could have come up with. And that is, it's a non-functional, or it was a non-functional disposable starting point for views. So it was just a folder full of static views. They all used the regular application layout, whatever. Basically, the developers told our front-end guy and the other designers, put your code in here and don't touch anything else. And so that's what we would do. We would just write a view in there. They would take that view. They would use that as a basis for the actual view. And then once they were done implementing it, they would toss it. It would just be get our end, and we would move on with our lives. So it's non-functional. It's just some code or blah, 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 lorem ipsum disposable, and it was just a starting point. But over the years, we realized that it needed to be somewhat functional. There needed to be something happening there, because we would end up in situations where, it does part of the job, but it's basically not doing a lot more than a mock-up, because they're like, oh, we'd have to still explain this needs to slide out, this page goes to this page, whatever your situation is. And then the disposable got really frustrating, because all of a sudden, the original view is gone, maybe they added a class or changed something or needed to change something, and we didn't have that reference point anymore, or we destroyed the reference point that wasn't code. So instead of the reference point being this view, the reference point is now over here, it's a PSD, we're back into pixels, and we don't want to be back into pixels. And it no longer became a starting point then. Once it wasn't disposable, it became a reference point. So the UI directory is now a demonstrative, maintained reference for markup. So it's still just a 12-line function that just logs every YAML file in one directory and pushes out a list. But it stays. And when we make changes to the application, a lot of the time we're making our changes in the UI, and then the developer is applying them to the real view. So it's this living, breathing reference point as to what the intended look of a particular page is and what the intended markup is. So, for example, this is the UI view at Hashrocket, like our hashrocket.com. So, it's gonna look like this. We've got all of our admin stuff in here, our blog, all this stuff lives under the same app, and it's a list of views. And a particular page looks like this. This is actually the client show page, like a piece of work that we've done. Scroll down, because most of the top page is a slide show. So you can see it's just filled with some filler text. And this lives. And we do this for our clients too, and oftentimes, as a designer, this means that when I need to validate a new idea with a client, I can go in and commit that into the view, instead of having to go back into Photoshop, and then when the client signs off on it, we can say, great, we can start working on this right now. This is already ready to go, it's sitting in a branch, and we can just fold it in. Excuse me. So, that's the UI directory in a nutshell. So, but as it started out, there were some other issues and the other two tools have helped us build more into the UI directory. Problem number 2, this is also super common, layout bugs with real data. So one of the things that we don't want to be doing is reacting backwards. Remember that chart where we reacting backwards because of something that isn't a functionality issue. It's a layout issue, and you guys might have experienced this with designers. I know I still fall prey to it occasionally, which is that something happened when the actual view was implemented that screwed up a float or something. All of a sudden some sidebar is broken, something's overflowing where it wasn't supposed to be. That kind of thing. I didn't realize that somebody's name would be 14 characters long, and now it sticks into the image or something like that. So what we use for that is Phil, which is a gem that I wrote as a non-Ruby person. I got away with it. It works fine. And it's a wrapper for Faker, and this actually started out, we were using Faker. Are you guys familiar with Faker? Okay. Yeah, so one day I was like, I wonder if, what's the developer solution for this? Because I'm tired of doing this. This is what I was doing in the UI views. In order to make things look full when I'm making the page, I'm pasting in a bunch of lorem ipsum. It's a pain in the butt to do. It's a bunch of code. It doesn't do the job that I need it to. It doesn't allow for avoiding unexpected nonsense. So the Hashrocket site has been built since using Phil, but I went back for fun the other day and did part of it in how we would have done it, and I wrote this as a subhead blog a lot over the past few years. So I said, can we use something that would make generating some usefully realistically random data? And the guys were like, yeah, we use Faker for that. So all Phil is a wrapper for Faker that outputs markup. So instead of having to do all of that nonsense, I can just write this. And this is actually the whole view for that page, including the slideshow and stuff. So, this should be pretty self-explanatory. I can just output a range of words. I can output a range of paragraphs. I can sit there and refresh the page and see a bunch of different outcomes, because Phil takes ranges for all that stuff. In particular interest, I guess, I'll use my laser. Markup just outputs an H2 and 2 paragraphs, another H2 and 2 paragraphs. Yay! There's no more stuff clogging up our Git repo, and it makes it really easy to write realistic looking code. So I don't know if this is something that you guys could use, but this was a huge help to us. And what the developers really liked about it, as a designer, I'm like, hey, I don't have to be embarrassed when the developers come back and say, this guy's name wrote the layout. But but what they really appreciate is that this translates almost directly into an actual working view. So a lot of the loops here, like this filled out sometimes, that just outputs whatever's in here 1 out of every 3 times, or you can actually pass an integer to it to make it 1 out of every n times. It's because not all of our show pages have quotes, so we want to make sure the page looks right, and that's not there. And that just translates directly to a conditional on their side. So it's very easy for them to go back and check the static view against the actual view, because they're line by line, they have a whole ton of similarities now. So it makes everybody happy. It really works well. The last one I want to talk about is accounting for all UI states. So, so we've developed a way to have some relatively trustworthy static views. We've made it a little bit easier to write and read those. But what kept coming up again and again is that, especially with a lot of apps these days, they're very front-end heavy. There's a lot of changes going on in a single view. And we've tried to tackle this a bunch of different ways. We used to have the application JavaScript also apply to the UI JavaScript, which would inevitably result in something breaking somewhere. We tried decoupling it entirely, and the UI, by the way, the UI uses its own layout and everything. It doesn't even use the application layout. It's completely decoupled. And so we decoupled the JavaScript as well, but then the problem we ran into is one of expertise. It's that, I write a fair amount of JavaScript, our other designers have varying levels of expertise with JavaScript, and we were writing JavaScript that was being thrown away when we have an Ember app in development, we use background in a bunch of places. So how can we simulate these states without writing a bunch of throwaway JavaScript and without stepping on the JavaScript as a real application? So the solution that I came up with for this is called Stagehand. And what Stagehand is this guy right there. You see that? It's that. So this is actually part of a view for an actual client project. You click on that little, I forget what it's called, little clappy action board graphic that I've made, and this little panel pops open. So this panel allows you to change the state of the page without actually interacting with the page. So if I want to change, this says add a report up here, and the options are none, no results, results. I can click on no results, the page changes, this other section is shown. I can click on results, I get this other section. So as a designer, I can go in and represent all the states of this in-page search without getting in the way of the regular application JavaScript, and actually without writing any JavaScript at all. So Stagehand allows us to just add data attributes. So a stage is a heading that's one group of those little states, and a scene is a particular state. Oh, there's no way to clear. Scene is a particular state. So one of our designers doesn't write a whole lot of JavaScript at all, and she's able to just go in and put these in really easily, build out the page, and we've made our static view even more useful to developers in terms of answering those questions, like what this page is supposed to look like this. And we've also alleviated unexpected layout changes or states where the designer forgot to do the empty state, or the designer did the empty state, and what we used to do is we put it into the code and then comment it out, and the developers wouldn't look, and they'd forget it was there, or they would look and we would have forgotten to put it in there. So it's allowed us to make the UI directory work for more front-end heavy apps. So that's kind of how Stagehand works in a nutshell. And the actual call to this is just, it's a single JavaScript call on the body. So it's just literally pasted in and then start writing data attributes and let it go. So the point of those 3 tools is to keep us from having to react all the way back to the PSD. It's to keep the conversation in the code base, and that's more code, fewer pixels. That's what that means. Is As a designer, I want to see my ideas understood properly, and I want to be able to answer questions easily, and then I want to be able to react accordingly and be flexible. And nothing is more flexible than being able to just change a couple lines in the CSS, change a couple lines in the view, commit that to Git, and to be able to tell a developer, hey, it's in there, you can see exactly what I changed. You know, this is the intent behind the design and everything else. So these three tools are pushing back on this React era. Like we want things to stay in the issue on CSS. And that's really worked well for us. So that's an overview of our tools, why they exist, like how our process works. Hopefully some of this stuff is useful for you, or will help you think about how best to like facilitate the handoffs that your team might be having to make on a daily basis. And I mean, overall, choose the tool that allows you to follow the process you want. Don't let it dictate how you work. And all of these tools have allowed us to facilitate how we work and are there to complement the particular skill set that each member of our team brings to the table. Also, this book is pretty good. It's the guy, creative director at Etsy. He's a smart guy. So, overall, deliver to communicate, know your expertise, facilitate your handoffs, and find tools to do that. Make your own tools, or use our tools. I don't care. Thanks, guys.